We all have that one musical artist where we're forced to advertise them to others by shrugging our shoulders and saying, well, the records are great, but you really had to be there. Artists where no amount of studio magic can recreate that swell of emotion that bubbles out of the room in their almost religious live performances. Nowadays, as concert promotion budgets balloon and ticket prices soar along with them, this seems like a more and more common feeling. But in James Brown's era, his status as a live performer was almost unparalleled. There's this energy just flying through the air at his shows that not only defines his artistry, but an entire cultural moment along with it. At the confluence of soul, R&B, and rock and roll, James Brown took all of the influences available to him and injected the mixture with anabolic steroids, personifying an era of limitless American dominance and an absolute field day of capitalist expansion. The individual had arrived to rule the world, and in no place do we see that more evidently than on James Brown Live at the Apollo 1962 by James Brown. James Brown was born into an impoverished family in South Carolina with a well-documented history of abuse in 1933. After a short stay in jail as a young man, he turned toward explicitly religious music, creating mostly gospel in his early career. His band, the Famous Flames, gradually got more centered on his magnetic stage personality, with Brown essentially taking over the band and making it his own. From the beginning, Brown's main appeal was his electric live shows, which stood out even in a crowded field of soul music made of incredible performers, which was why making such a big marketing push behind this live album made sense. Starting after this album's release, Brown's melodies and harmonies would become simpler, while his rhythms would get more complicated. And this plays into why some music historians credit James Brown with recording the first funk song in 1967. That style became a wildly popular answer to a jazz scene which had been increasingly consumed by a cerebral, nerdy obsession with harmonic complexity. And his percussive, nearly spoken vocals from this time directly influenced the formation of hip-hop. And also, those iconic and inventive drum breaks were sampled into all kinds of hip-hop and dance songs, and you still see them come up all the time today. James Brown's funky style would eventually lose out to disco on the R&B charts. But of course, James Brown was still a very revered musician within those disco circles. But one thing he would always have is his vocal intensity. That intensity harkens back to a pre-amplification music landscape, one ruled by traditions of call and response. And to make that vocal presentation even more dramatic, he was known for going hard on stage until he literally couldn't anymore, collapsing with exhaustion and bringing everything to an emotional climax. But those live shows weren't just emotionally intense for the audience. James Brown was known to monetarily fine his band members for playing a wrong note or dancing out of time. He was famously an extremely intense boss across the board who demanded everything about his sonic and visual performance to be precisely to his liking. Unsurprisingly, given these control freak tendencies, he started his career radically anti-drug, obsessed with law and order politics, and generally opposed to discussing social justice in his music. And I know what you're thinking. One of this guy's most famous songs is Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. But a few years after the song's release, he would say publicly that he regretted making it in the first place, despite its status as an immortal anthem of the civil rights era. Throughout his life, this obsession with control and order manifested in increasingly disordered ways, as Brown's own behavior devolved into deadbeat absentee fatherhood and an addiction to, you guessed it, PCP, which worsened a growing trend of domestic violence. Brown's abuse of multiple domestic partners, including one who was 17 years of age at the time of their relationship, is well documented, thoroughly corroborated, and at times almost outright self-admitted. So of course, you can say a lot of things about James Brown. He was an excellent stage performer, a funk, R&B, soul, rock and roll musician, but in many ways, James Brown was the quintessential American rock star and a personification of the zeitgeist of the time. On the surface, James Brown was energetic, magnanimous, wealthy, magnetic, and all of those same aspects of his personality which built him into a star destroyed those around him through its perversion into violence and abuse. That hidden world was right there, just below the surface, but that flashy, forward-facing persona was just too much to ignore. And that chaotic, directionless energy pops up to the surface on live albums like Live at the Apollo. Just like today, live albums were then seen as supplements or promotional materials to existing repertoires. In addition to that, this album contains no previously unreleased songs. The tracks were mostly written by Brown with a few exceptions, but nothing here was written specifically for a debut on this live album. That makes this this a pretty much unchanged representation of Brown's stage show at around this time, something you'd hear on any given night when you bought a ticket to one of his shows. Naturally, the record company was a little reluctant to get on board, but when they greenlit the project, it paid off big time. This outsold most live albums of the time by a mile. And the record company eventually went through with this because they realized there's just no other way to capture what James Brown did. The audience is absolutely out of control from beginning to end. And that constant participation from the audience directly calls back to the history of call and response traditions. And you get absolute vocal pandemonium at all times, making you constantly wonder how anyone could do this day in and day out and still have a voice at all. And it's also important to note here that given Brown's later reputation as a funk musician, we're still in his traditionalist era here. We're not getting anything sonically groundbreaking with this record. We're just getting the hardest possible realization of the potential that lies within the movement of soul, R&B, and rock and roll. The chord progressions still mostly follow blues traditions, and they haven't dropped back to the simplicity of funk music yet. Syncopation shows up, but it shows up in the same levels that you'd expect from R&B at the time, and that horn support from the Famous Flames firmly places this record into the soul category. Now, those of you with an interest in a certain corner of music history might already be picking out the similarities between this album and another record which has picked up steam on the internet. After decades as serving as one of those your favorite artist's favorite album type records, something that's hugely influential but that your average person probably wouldn't have a copy of in their house. The MC5, credited with a huge influence on the formation of punk music alongside their personal friends in Iggy and the Stooges, absolutely adored this specific James Brown album, and they cited it as a direct influence whenever they were creating Kick Out the Jams. The MC5 were also known locally for a wild live show. They even included a hype man's intro as their first track, and they played a stripped back style infused with enormous levels of energy. If you were to ask someone now what lasting influence we see from James Brown today in music, their first answer would probably be something in the funk or hip-hop lineage. But there's an argument to be made. He's an equally influential figure in the creation of punk rock. This connection brings up some interesting questions. The original punk movement was similarly ideologically lost, constantly mired in a controversy of their own making, as they assembled a hodgepodge of extremist political symbols to provoke public outrage and keep their scene underground. Now, of course, James Brown never quite reached those levels of extremism, but his constant oscillation between Democrat and Republican, his public flirtations with nationalism, and his simultaneous embrace of black identity and genuinely racist politicians made him an ideological orphan. Interestingly, the punk movement created this way of thinking from the ground up, but James Brown was already well into being a household name by the time he started getting involved in these types of conversations. Regardless, you can see forming here an anti-narrative system of thought, which we would later recognize as postmodern, a system of thinking which rejects any grand story arc that explains all of history and your place in it. And this deconstructivist thinking would come to dominate culture from the academy to the masses, starting in the late 60s and onwards until only extremely recently. This frantic, aimless energy for energy's sake of the American post-war explosion didn't start or end here, but James Brown's version of this message as a live performer instantly stands out as a high watermark, culturally, economically, and aesthetically. As the shrieks of the crowd die down, the house lights come on, and the encore never comes, we're left wondering just where to direct this emphatic tsunami, searching desperately for an outlook or a framework to believe in, and in the process overcommitting in ways that set us in the audience at one another's throats. Thank you for watching.